Сегодня в этом замечательном пространстве In Liberty у нас начнется первая лекция с Паскалем Буайе, антрополог, эволюционный психолог. Более подробно о лекции расскажет Мария Фаликман, которая является руководителем департамента психологии социального факультета Высшей школы экономики. И она, как эксперт в этой области, более подробно и представит лекцию и будет, партнером в дискуссии с нашим замечательным лектором. Мария.
Всем добрый вечер. Итак, у нас сегодня замечательная тема в одной из наиболее актуальных областей современной психологии, современной науки. Это эволюционный подход к человеческим сообществам, к человеческой психике, к человеческому познанию. И в частности, сегодняшний гость этого пространства, гость теории и практик Паскаль Буайе изучает вопрос, каким образом, под влиянием каких факторов эволюции индивидуальной психики складываются человеческие убеждения, человеческие верования и человеческие сообщества тоже. Сейчас, насколько я понимаю, нам покажут небольшой ролик.
Thank you. Good evening. It's a great pleasure to talk tonight and organize this event. So, first of all, I need to thank the people who organized this, and Maria Benceva at Alpina, and of course Maria Felikman for conducting this discussion. And also, I'm very grateful to all of you for showing up this evening in Moscow and even later in Perm to hear this. So. Today I want to tell you about very general problems that we have when we try to understand how human evolution, the fact that our genetic evolution took millions of years and ended up with the capacities we have, how that evolution connects to the kinds of societies that humans build, create, and maintain. It may seem that those two issues are very different and that genes have little to do with the way societies work and they're not really connected. I want to show you in several examples that they are actually connected and that they are connected through one particularly important thing, which is that human evolution results in constructing a particular kind of human mind, a brain mind, if you want, that has all sorts of specific capacities, specific preferences, and specific motivations. And that if we study those, and if we study the impact of evolution on those capacities, we can better understand the way human societies work and the way they are built, the way they disappear or reappear, and their common features as well as their differences. So today we'll talk about some general properties of this problem, but I will also give you a few examples. And this is where I will switch to, instead of just talking to you, showing you a presentation as well with PowerPoint slides. So this will start in a second if the system works. No. Okay. Let me just start this presentation. Right. So the idea is how human evolution explains human minds and how human minds explain human society. This is, of course, a very large set of questions, and they've been dealt with by lots of people over centuries, but I want to show you that recent research makes it possible to understand those questions in a particularly in a different way and in a much better way. The details about all that kind of thing are explained in a book that I published last year and is just now published by Alpina. And this is where you can find more details if you want about these things. But first I want to ask the question of, why write this book and why write it now? The thing is that we have all sorts of questions about societies, like, why is there ethnic conflict? Why are there religions in human societies? Is there a sort of natural form of the family, or are family forms infinitely diverse, and could they diverge indefinitely? What is social justice in human societies? What is the difference between a just society and an unjust society? Or questions like, why do we have morality? Why are human beings? Why do human beings have moral intuitions, moral feelings, and moral behaviors? And of course, also, in what circumstances are those dispositions activated, and what conditions are they not activated, so that we find immoral behavior? And I think those questions, which have been the subject of lots of philosophy and lots of reflection over centuries, are now being dealt with in a slightly different way, because of all sorts of results in experimental sciences and empirical sciences like biology, but also psychology, economics, and to a certain degree anthropology and sociology as well. And what is happening as a result of all this is not that you have a new grand theory of what societies are or how they work. What you have is a convergence of lots of different results from different disciplines that address these questions, like the ones I listed above, and make them easier to understand and perhaps easier to answer. So the one overarching perspective in all these empirical sciences is that human nature matters. That is, human beings are not blank slates that are just influenced by their surroundings. Human beings have innate or evolved preferences and capacities that make it possible for them to live in societies, but also these preferences and capacities make societies be of a particular kind, with particular kinds of institutions. In other words, we cannot expect pure random phenomena in social phenomena, but we can expect lots of commonalities in human societies. So today, I can't talk about all these different questions, obviously, but I want to talk about two of them, which are pretty important. One is why religious ideas in most human societies are very much the same, and why they're concentrated on particular sets of ideas to do with agents, with persons of superhuman nature. And that's something we find in all human societies. And then I want to talk about another completely different problem, which is what makes some political programs persuasive, in particular in the descriptions of the economy and what to do with the economy. And why do people think that some ways of thinking about the economy are more persuasive than others? Now, you will notice that the first one is something that you find in all human societies that we know. The second one is really characteristic of modern societies. In prehistory, we didn't have political programs because we didn't have an economy in the sense of a large set of interacting agents. So we didn't have political programs. So this is a new, an innovation of modern societies. And you might think, well, if it's modern, it can't really have anything to do with our human evolution. So it has a lot to do with human evolution and its consequences for human minds. So first of all, I want to give you a little background about general aspects of how evolution has an effect on human minds. The main sort of results from what people call evolutionary psychology, which is a sort of combination of evolution, psychology, biology, economics, and all that, is that like any other species, humans are confronted with very specific problems. For example, mating, which is the term we use for, finding partners and reproduction and things like that. So this is a kind of problem that obviously you have to solve. That is, in order to reproduce, you have to find partners. You have to know what to do with those partners. You have to make sure that reproduction leads to offspring, and so on and so forth. Another kind of example of a problem that we faced for millennia and probably for millions of years is foraging. That is, finding nutrition and in very diverse environments, and managing to actually get the best of what can be got from an environment. Another example is warfare. We know that for a long time, human groups have had some kind of hostility between groups, as well as occasional cooperation between groups. So there was the possibility of cooperation, but also of primitive warfare between groups. And in order to engage in warfare, you have to have a psychology that allows it. So there are species that do it. Chimpanzees, for example, have conflicts between groups. There are other species that don't do it, where there's only conflict between individuals, but no conflict between groups. So that means that you have to have specific capacity. Now, the central idea of evolutionary psychology is that for each of these problems, you have to have a distinct kind of capacity or module, which is very much like, having specialized software. When you don't want to treat texts, you need some program that does text, and it's not very good at doing images. When you want to handle images, you need software that does it. That is usually not very good at doing texts. And that's the idea. Then the mind is, in the same way, consists of different specialized systems that do these different things, like mating, foraging, and warfare. Rather than a general intelligence that tries to do everything, we have these specialized capacities. So these capacities only attend to specific information in environments. So, for example, the information that we need for foraging has to do with seasons, with the ripening of particular fruit or plants or things like that. And that's it. And it computes the sort of best places to go to get some food. When we do warfare, it's a completely different thing, because we have to assess, for example, how big another group is, how hostile they are, how committed they are to either cooperating with us or not. So you attend to different things in the environment. And they have specific rules. And again, the best comparison is to software that's specialized in one kind of problem, but not the other. And the most important feature is that the operation of those systems is mostly unconscious. That is, for example, people who do foraging in an environment and try to find food are processing on the basis of all sorts of memories where the best places are. But the computations that tell them where the best places are often unconscious. In the same way, we have preferences for certain partners for reproduction, and we don't know why. We don't just know that they sort of look better or look more or seem more interesting as a person, and so on. But we don't have access to the way our brain is computing these things. In the same way, when you understand language, you go directly to the meaning of what people are saying, and you have no idea how your brain decodes all the sounds into words. So I must give you some examples of those evolved systems, and that will make things a bit more intuitive. So as I said, foraging, the function of that kind of mental system is to optimize resource extraction. Now, you and I live in a place where we don't actually forage in the sense of trying to find, plants and animals that we can eat in the environment, but we go shopping and very much use the same sort of ideas about foraging to modern environments like shopping, where we have to maintain statistics on, for example, the means and the variance of different resources. So, for example, do these stores always have this kind of food, or different foods at different times? How much are they worth for us, in the sense that what are the prices, and so on and so forth. So we do that. And a lot of this statistical system is not done consciously. You just sort of have the intuition that one place is better than another, but you don't really know how you built this interest. Language is obviously a very good example of a largely unconscious system. When you hear a stream of words, what you hear is not a stream of words, actually, it's a stream of sounds. And actually, out of those sounds, you have to extract the sounds of the language, and you have to build the hallucination, so to speak, that people used one word after another, whereas in fact, what they did was produce a continuous stream of sound. So you have to extract from that information that is very noisy, all sorts of information about the phrase structure, that is the organization of the sentence. You have to access the vocabulary in your brain. You have to make certain allowances for phonology so that you understand what they're saying, even in a noisy environment, and so on. But you don't know how you do that. So mating, as I said, we know that human beings, when they think of attractiveness, are very often attending to cues which in lots of environments correlate with people's health and fertility and commitment to other people. We know that, but actually, that is, biologists know that. But when we go around and see some people as more interesting, attractive in terms of personality or looks or things like that, we don't know that the system that is doing that is actually tracking things that have to do with fertility or commitment. Another example, I have several examples like that, and I think it's good to have lots of examples because that tells you roughly how these systems work. So, for example, we have an intuitive biology, that is, all of us have a representation of different living species as being really different. That dogs are different to cats, from cats, and cats from rabbits, and so on. And this kind of intuitive biology is built during our first years, but it's built very often on the basis of information that is very fragmentary. So, for example, we all have ideas about the behavior of a whole species. So we think that what you know about tigers, about one tiger, applies to most tigers. Whereas we don't think that what applies to one person applies to all persons. So we generalize on species in a way that is largely done by unconscious principles. Why do we extend expectations about behavior to a whole species rather than simply a set of organisms? Why do I think that the way this tiger behaved tells me a lot about tigers in general, but not about tigers in the evening, or not about tigers about this particular individual? That is what we call intuitive biology. Other examples that will be very, very important in what I'm going to talk about today are intuitive psychology, or what some psychologists call theory of mind. And the function of that system is to produce description of other individuals' mental states. Now, the thing is that mental states are invisible. Whether you believe X or you believe Y is not something that I can see. Whether you're angry, frustrated, happy, or whatever is largely something that is difficult to see. what you intend to do in the next 5 minutes is not something that I can see. What I need is a system that looks at things like your past behavior, your face, the emotional expressions on your face, but also your access to information, whether you know or you don't know a particular fact, in order to produce a description of what is inside your head. And we know that it's a specialized system because we know that there are people whose minds work rather fine, except that this system is impaired. And that's the case in autism, for example. So autistic individuals are people whose mental systems work, but not this intuitive psychology system. And they have great difficulty in understanding other people's intentions and thoughts. Another system that is very important for what we're going to talk about tonight is coalitional psychology. That is the way we recruit people to form groups, alliances, coalitions. And that is true of small groups. Like, you know, if you work in an office, you know that people always have little alliances, cliques, or little groups that are more coherent than the rest, and sometimes they plot against other little groups like that. And that's true also of tribal solidarity, but it's also true of ethnic and national solidarity. Now we have to have some psychology that makes it possible for us to form these huge coalitions. As I said, chimps, for example, have coalitions and they have intergroup conflict. However, their coalitions are small, and they break down very easily. Whereas humans can form coalitions that are extremely large, and they can do it in a way that's very stable. Another kind of system that is going to be important is part of our morality intuition, consists in fairness instincts. What I mean by that is a whole set of preferences and capacities that make cooperation between humans possible and avoid free riding, that is cheating, that is taking benefits without paying costs. And those systems in the mind, for example, pay great attention to equity in exchange. I will give you more details about the way that works, about people's behavior in past interactions. It's quite clear that, for example, for us, that if someone has cheated at some point, we want to avoid future interactions with them. And that means that we have to have the capacity to store these events in memory and produce the appropriate inferences or consequences for them. Now, why would all this matter to understanding societies? Well, I think we can understand how this matters by looking at examples, and today in particular, by looking at two examples, and one of them is religions. So this is something that's explained in another book that was published in Moscow recently, and I can only give you a little part of this account. So the idea is, well, what makes religious concept attractive? And by attractive, I means why is it that human minds attend to them? And why is it that they store them in memory? Why is it that those concepts count for people who are interesting people? So there are lots of things that make religion what it is. And of course, in that book, I looked at lots of different factors. And there is also something to remember, which is that religion is complex because there are lots of different types of religious activity. And in particular, there's a difference between what we could call informal religious activity that we found in all human societies from prehistory. And these are activities that, for example, consist in shamanism, divination, things of that kind. And then there's what we often think of when we use the word religions, which is organized religion, organized institutions. doctrine and personnel, like, Islam or Christianity or Buddhism. That is, movements that have institutions, that have doctrines and scripture and texts that tell you what the doctrine is, and have specialists who are trained by other specialists in a formal way. Now, this form of religion is the one we're familiar with in modern societies, but it's not the one we found in lots of human societies. It's a recent innovation. It only happens in state societies. So in general, what I called informal religious activity is more typical of what we find in human groups. So we can look at, some of the concepts that are widespread. And the concepts that are widespread in lots of different religions have to do with agents, that is, quasi-persons who have superhuman properties, like spirits in lots of religions, like ancestors in lots of tribal religions, ghosts, the souls of dead people, but also the gods, and the god of monotheism as well. Now, what makes such concepts attractive? Well, what we know is that in religious ideas, we always have people interacting or imagining they're interacting with superhuman agents that have specific properties. And I'll give you a few illustrations of that. Think of ancestors, for example. Ancestors are superhuman agents who are dead people, but they're not corpses, right? They're not the physical substance of dead people, but they're just their souls. And usually they retain the personal identity of the deceased person. They're connected to our genealogy. That is, in lots of places where we worship ancestors, the two images here refer to ancestor cult in Rome, in ancient Rome, and the bottom image is about Korea. So these are two different societies, but where ancestor worship works very much in the same way. The ancestors are thought to be protective agents. They help us, but they require exchange. They require bargaining and sacrifice. And that's true, for example, of Roman ancestors, but also of Roman gods, that they want things out of human beings, and human beings have to give them those things. And those ceremonies have to be done by specific people. Now, usually those ancestors in most tribal societies are associated with groups. And there are material objects like these sculptures you see on top that are used for worship because the soul is not material. So this is almost universal in tribal societies, in chiefdoms, and in many, many complex societies. Another kind of religious activity that is not totally organized by institutions has to do with spirits and souls and things like that. And the idea is that there are spirits around, or gods, and that they have effects on special situations. And once again, they require information from humans, so you have to tell them what is going on. But sometimes they require economic exchange, so you have to give them things. And again, some people are thought to be special, so some people are a good channel for those spirits because they are mediums, they are shamans, or they're priests, and they have a better connection to superhuman agents than the rest. Now, you find that these cults can be improvised, but they can be very often stabilized and become established religion. So this is the kind of stuff you find in human religion. Now, why do we have these particular concepts, and what do they look like? In psychological terms, these concepts are represented in people's minds according to this template, this very general sort of structure. So first of all, this concept, when you talk about gods or spirits, you activate in your mind a particular concept, which is the concept of person, which is a concept that we have already. And is basically the concept of an individual that has mental life, intentions and goals and things like that, and can interact with us. So we interact with one person in a way that is different from our interaction with another person. And that's what makes persons, as opposed to generic human beings. So gods and ghosts are considered to be persons. But then, in lots of religious ideologies, you have a violation of a property that you could infer from that concept. So, for example, persons are usually in one place, and they are usually physically located. But religious ideologies tell you that no, ghosts, for example, go through walls, or that gods can be in several places instead of one place. Or they could tell you that they have special biological properties that you would not expect from an ordinary person, like, being immortal or having several different lives and so on and so forth. And a third aspect that is very important is that except for that violation, like, for example, ghosts go through walls, gods are in many places. Apart from that, everything else that we think about those gods and ghosts and other agents is completely what we would predict from the idea of a person. So when we think about gods, or spirits, we think that they perceive what's going on, they think about what's going on, they remember, they intend, they feel, and all those things work in exactly the same way as we expect human minds to work. So just think of the Old Testament, where God is described as being extremely counterintuitive in the sense that he is everywhere and has created everything and will never be submitted to death and birth and death and so on and so forth. And then the Old Testament is full of stories in which God says, you did this and I thought you would do that. And because you didn't do that, I am very angry. So I will react like an angry person and punish you. And this is the kind of psychology that we invariably expect from other human beings that is projected onto this different kind of superhuman agent. And this is something that is present in lots of cultures, and you'll find that it's transmitted in a particular way, which is that the counterintuitive aspects are made explicit. So when people tell you about spirits, they will say, oh, they're invisible, you can't see them. When people tell you about gods, they'll tell you, oh, they're eternal and they can, do lots of stuff that you cannot ever. Or, for example, ghosts, you will be told, well, yeah, he's a ghost, so he can go through physical obstacles. But there's also in transmission, there's an implicit aspect, something that is not made explicit, which is, other than this counterintuitive aspect, take the superhuman agent to be exactly like any other agent. So, for example, you are not told that God has a mind and he remembers what happened in the past, and he is very angry if you don't do what he wanted you to do. You're not told that because you don't need to be told that, because you already know that, because you have your psychology that tells you that that's the way persons work. Now, lots of experimental studies have shown that this combination of explicit counterintuitive idea and implicit confirmation of all our expectations, this combination is optimal for memory and for transmission. That is, people acquire these concepts and remember them, and they transmit them to other people better than other possible concepts. And this kind of sticks in human culture. That is, it remains very stable because the counterintuitive information attracts attention. And the intuitive background, on the other hand, makes reasoning possible. So, for example, if you think that the God has a mind like ours, then you can think that if I do something that is unpleasant for the God will be annoyed with me. Or if I do something that's good for the God will favor me. That's the sort of thing that you can only do if you if you assume implicitly that the God has the same mind that you have. So it seems that even though human religions are on the surface very different, and of course they are very different, at the same time, we have this situation in which many of them, or I would say almost all of them, are based on some concepts that are not always made explicit, but are of a very similar format. And why is that the case? Well, I think this is the case mostly because we have mental systems that are the same in all human beings and that put constraints on how we build cultures. So, for example, why do we have these counterintuitive physical properties of gods? Well, because human beings do have what we call an intuitive physics, that is, expectations about persons as physical objects. So when you encounter other human beings, you do not expect to go right through them. You expect to collide with them if you are in the same trajectory. On the other hand, so that means that descriptions, for example, of persons as going through walls will be very striking. And they're very striking because of that intuitive physics system that develops from infancy, from the first month of life. And that is a system that is so common to all human beings that it can be tested in the same way in all human cultures, and also that it can be tested from the age of 6 months or even 3 months. So that is the system that makes some properties of gods and spirits very strange or attention grabbing. That is, they catch your attention. And also, why are mental processes projected onto gods and spirits? So that's the second part. Why do we think that gods and spirits have minds in the same way as human beings? Well, it's because our intuitive psychology, which I described as the system that makes us understand other minds, is something that we also have in common. All human beings, except the ones who have some special pathology, have this intuitive system in the mind that tells us how to translate people's behaviors into invisible entities like beliefs and intentions. In other words, this really shows that these evolved systems are what makes those cultural systems work. At this point, I will stop this presentation because my PowerPoint system is frozen, and I will restart it, and that will just take 1 minute. And I hope you can, in the meantime, think about these things and think about questions about these things. And then we can go into the second part of this presentation. So let me restart the system and restart the presentation. I'm sorry about this technical problem. Okay. I think we're back. Yes, I'm sorry that we seem to have problems with PowerPoint. Oh, no, there we are. Okay. The system is just getting very slow. So, as I said, what we know about human minds and the way they work tells us something about, not about the diversity of different religions, but about the common features and the ones that we can expect and how we can expect them. Now, the same kind of reasoning can be applied to something that is very different, which is the way political programs can be made persuasive and can have some attractiveness for human beings. So here is what this is about. Why do people believe some political ideologies? And of course, I know this is a complex problem, and there are lots of reasons why some people believe some political ideologies. But I want to get into one specific aspect of that, which is economic programs, and show you that even though they're about modern institutions and organizations, they really are constrained or influenced by universal human dispositions, parts of human nature. So a lot of politics is about how to manage the economy. Of course, there's lots of other things in politics, but I will focus on this one because that's the way in a modern democracy people have different programs, and they're about different ways of managing the economy. Now, the thing is that lots of political scientists and economists have said, well, one kind of difficult situation in modern societies is that economies are extremely complicated, and it's not quite clear that people really understand the economy. So that is a problem for politics, because how do people judge political programs if they don't understand what they're about? I will focus here on what I call folk economic beliefs, that is, popular economic beliefs that are widespread in the population. These are thoughts that are explicit thoughts. Okay, so that's not just intuitions, but they are explicit thoughts that people can articulate and can express about economic processes, but that are not the result of being educated in economics. I will give you examples of those, and if you read those, you'll recognize things that lots of people say about economic processes. Like, if some countries are rich, that's because others are poor. If a business makes a profit, it must be because people are not paid enough. Immigration takes jobs away from us. Some people would have the opposite belief, that immigration creates demand, so it creates lots of jobs. Some people might think that to cure unemployment, we should distribute the available work amongst other people. Or take this one, that there is a fixed amount of wealth to distribute among people. So that is a very common belief in lots of countries, and in political programs are based on this notion. All these notions are not notions of economics. They are notions that people have without studying economics or reading about economics. Now, when professional economists look at these things, they always say this is terrible. And they say, for example, they use the word fallacies constantly. These are 3 or 4 books that use these terms. And once again, my system, I'm sorry, is a bit slow and doesn't display everything. So why do we have these beliefs? Well, again, as PowerPoint is not working, I will switch to directly talking to you people, and hopefully if the image can go through, that will be better. I'm not sure anyone can see me now. Okay. So why do we have those economic beliefs? Well, there's one explanation, which is that it's simply that we don't know about economics. So some people say, well, people have these beliefs that are not totally correct about the economy simply because they haven't studied economics. But however, that's not quite true in the sense that, that is true, but it's not the only explanation, in the sense that sometimes when people are given economic explanations, they still believe in those beliefs. Some people would say that, well, it's because of self-interest. That is, people have the economic beliefs that will bring them more money, so to speak. And that's not true, because lots of economic beliefs people have go against their own interest. So, for example, in lots of countries, people believe that it's better to export a lot than to import a lot. And lots of economists say, well, that's true under certain conditions, but not in all conditions. So, for example, take another example, lots of people in lots of countries think that foreign trade is not good. What we should do is produce everything we need in our country, and that would be better than paying foreigners for what we need. Well, actually, in many cases, you can get what you want from foreigners cheaper than what you can make yourself. So it's against your own interest to say that you should produce everything. So some people say, no, people have these economic beliefs because of propaganda, because politicians and newspapers tell them these things. And that, again, is not entirely true, and is not an explanation, because usually politicians and other propagandists, what they do is they follow what people will want to hear, much more than imposing any beliefs on them. So yes, there is an effect of propaganda, perhaps, and politicians, but politicians are not usually naive, and they don't just try to impose beliefs on people who don't have any of those beliefs. What they rather try to do is exploit the beliefs people have in order to gain power and status. So the question is, what makes such ideas very natural? And to understand that, we have to understand that we are human beings who evolved in environments that were not the environments of modern economies. And in particular, our environments for hundreds of thousands of years, that is the environment in which our human minds evolved, is not the environment of large societies. It's the environment of small bands, groups of 20 to 50 people who live in a tribe of maybe 300 or 500 people, where you have very occasional encounters with complete strangers. The rest of the population is people you know. Okay. So the transactions that happen in such environments are transactions in which you have almost no fixed capital. That is, you work with your hands and that's all you do, and you have a few tools and that's all there is. There's a limited division of labor. Some people are good at something. Some people are good at hunting. Some people are good at fishing or foraging. But there's not that much of a division of labor. There is almost no accumulation. So we evolved in an ancestral environment of nomadic foraging. So since you're walking a lot, that means that you cannot accumulate any physical goods to a great extent. You can have a few tools, and that's about it. So, for example, the people in this picture are hunting. They hunt with nets, and the nets are the only thing, more or less, that they need for this economic activity. That's nothing else. And finally, a very important part of the way we did transaction in our environment of evolution all the way to very recently is that we had a few people, but we knew a lot about them. In other words, you know what people have done in the past, you know who they interacted with, you know what they did with them, and so on and so forth. Now, that resulted in what psychologists and economists call an exchange psychology. That is, a set of ideas we have intuitively about what exchange is like. So first of all, we evolved in societies where we have partner choice. What that means is that you choose who to cooperate with. And even though you're in a small place, you avoid the ones that are not being fair with you. So, for example, we know that in primitive societies, what leads to division and the fission of a group, that is the division of a group into two groups, is unfair behavior from some individuals. So some people think they're being exploited and they just leave. So we have this choice. And because we have this choice, it means we're sensitive to what makes some people better than others. Another condition of our exchange psychology is that we depend a lot on reputation. In primitive societies, unlike most other animals, we have a very good memory for interactions with other individuals. That is, who did what with us, what they did, how much they gave us, how much they took from us, and so on and so forth. And also we communicate with others, we gossip, we communicate about these interactions with others. And that is something that for us is part of normal exchange. And if you think this is an archaic thing, it's not, in the sense that we like that. For example, in modern trade, there are lots of websites that if you buy a book online, you will buy a book from a website that has all sorts of comments on what the book is like. If you go and if you want to buy a product, some other product, you'll find that there are lots of reviews, comments on these things, and people intuitively like that because they like to exchange information about exchange. Okay, they like to communicate about exchange. Another very important part of our exchange psychology is cheater detection. And again, this is something that's been observed in lots of different human societies. So a cheater in economic terms is just simply someone who takes a benefit and doesn't pay the cost. So, for example, someone who will ride on the subway but not pay for a ticket, or someone who will quite simply steal your stuff from you, or say a contractor who will not do the work in your house, even though you gave them some money in advance, and so on and so forth. Now, psychologists like Lida Cosmides and John Tooby and many others have done lots of experiments that show that we are highly sensitive to cheater and to the detection of cheater, and that people are very much focused on intentional cheating more than its effects. So if people try to cheat you by getting stuff out of you without paying you in return, if you can see that they have the intention of doing that, that is sufficient to exclude them as partners, even if the interaction was about very, very small amounts of money. On the other hand, if someone takes a benefit from you without paying the cost, but you realize that it's by accident, you do not want to exclude them. So we are more sensitive to intentions than to costs. Finally, we have a very important part of our exchange psychology, which is an intuition that exchanges should be fair. And I'll take a very simple example. Say you and I go and paint a house for someone else, but I work 10 hours on this job, and you only work 5 hours. And then we get $150 for the work, which is quite a lot of money for that, but it's easy for the arithmetic. So I worked 10 hours, you worked only 5 hours. How do we divide the 150? Well, in all human societies, and even very young children from the age of 3 or 4, think that the best way to divide is to divide in as a proportion of the amount of work you did. So if I worked 10 hours and you worked 5, I should get $100 and you should get 50. In other words, people think that equity, justice, is better than equality, having the same thing. And this, in a way, is a consequence of partner choice. If you have a choice between lots of partners, you will choose the ones who work on this principle of fairness in exchange more than the ones who don't. So these are very important parts of our minds, our economic minds, so to speak. They're present in archaic societies, probably. They're very much present in all present societies. We see that they're developed from a very early age. And I think they have an effect on our economic beliefs. Why is that? Because when we think of transactions, exchange with people, we don't just think of resources, but we think of resources and their effects on social investments. What I mean by that is that we think of transactions as having an effect on how well disposed people will be with us. And for example, on goodwill and our reputation and things like that. I'll give you examples even in very modern societies, but especially in very modern societies and modern commerce on the internet. People are highly sensitive to whether a particular firm has what's called fair price or not a fair price. So we see these things in terms of fairness more than benefits. And I can give you examples of that. For example, people would rather shop on a website that has the same price for everybody, which they think is fair, rather than a website that adapts the prices to the customers. It's a modern practice that websites very often evaluate where you call them from, how many times you've been there before, and so on and so forth. And they change their price according to that information, because they have the assumption that they can get more money from some people than others, and therefore they can charge a higher price from some people. Now, human beings in general absolutely hate this kind of thing. They find it very unfair, and because it violates our intuitions of fairness. And that's why companies that do that try very much to hide that they're doing that. So these assumptions make us very receptive to some economic beliefs. So, for example, why do we have the idea of a fixed pie? That is the idea that there is an amount of wealth that is finite, and the point of politics is to divide it between people. Well, we evolved in situations where wealth was always zero sum. That is, there were no gains in productivity. So all the stuff that you've hunted and all the stuff that you've gathered are goods that cannot be made better by exchange. They are just what they are. So because of that, the idea of the fixed pie, which is very popular in popular economics, the idea that you can only make some people richer because others are poor. That's an idea that is very intuitive for us, very natural for us, because we evolved in a system, in an economy where there was zero-sum wealth. Second, the preference for fairness, which is why, for example, we have a great resistance to monopolies and large corporations. In the US, and I suppose in lots of other countries, if you describe a product as being made by a very large corporation, people expect that the price will not be a fair price. It will be imposed on them by this large corporation that they see as having more power than they have. So we resist to that because we have this intuition of fairness. But also, we have a personal exchange. We want to exchange from people we know. And that triggers this notion that markets, in the sense of anonymous collaboration between millions of individuals who do not know each other, will result in negative outcomes, in cruelty or unjust outcomes. That's because in the environments where we evolved, you only exchange with people you knew, and you chose them because you knew they had been fair in the past. So the market, in the sense of giving you interaction with people you've never met and you will never meet, and you don't know much about what they've done before, seems to us to create negative results. Finally, we also have a preference for our own in-group, as people say, our own group. So we evolved from groups that had very high solidarity inside the group and a bit of hostility between the groups, or occasionally cooperation between groups. Now, we still have that in the sense that we spontaneously group ourselves in ethnicity or nation, and we have a hostile attitude to other ethnicities or nation. And that is why we think very often that foreign trade is not a great idea, because we know that foreign trade will be good for the others. And then we use our zero-sum assumption, and that we think, well, if they get richer, we get poorer. And because of that, we don't want them to get richer. We want to keep the wealth for ourselves. And that's why lots of people, for example, think that we should grow everything in our country. We should make everything in our country, because if we buy stuff from the others, we're making them richer. And they think by making them richer, we make ourselves poorer. So these economic beliefs that we derive from our human nature, they have lots of effects on politics. So take the example of debates about social welfare. Should we give money to unemployed people, for example? Well, there are two kinds of intuitions that we have about that. One is cheater detection. We see those people who receive those benefits as being exploited. They are getting something and they're not doing anything to get it. And that's why we very often see welfare benefits as something that is a bit like cheating. And that we think, well, we shouldn't have too much welfare expenses. But we also have a different intuition, which conflicts with the first one, which is that, well, welfare recipients are people who are the unfortunate victims of some misfortune, like they were fired from their job, but they didn't do anything to be fired. That was it. And in that case, we immediately think of it as a sense as sharing in the group, like we did when we were in tribal societies. That is, we have to help the ones who are victimized. And that's why very often when we have debates about welfare, you'll see that in many European countries, for example, people used to be very much for welfare when it was inside the nation, as it were. So Swedish or Danish people would give money to Swedish or Danish people who are the victims of some misfortune. But when you have lots of immigrants, suddenly people think that welfare is all about cheating, because they see it as another group is trying to exploit us. Take another example, the debates about privatization or public ownership. So we think that exchange is fair if we know the partners. And we tend to think that markets are places where we don't know the partners. We don't know what they want or how they will behave. So we tend to think that markets are bad, and therefore the state would do better than private companies, because we tend to think that the state is an agent that we can influence, but we think of the markets as made of anonymous agents that we cannot influence. So to sum up, humans do not think like economists, like professional economists, but that's not a bad thing. It's just that they think like members of the human species, which is not the same. So to conclude, what do we do when we do social sciences and take evolution into account? Well, why do we talk about genes and evolution? Well, I'll tell you, first of all, that we have a common assumption when we talk about these things, which is that we think that humans acquire lots of information from their environment and their culture, and that's true. But then we think that because of that, they need less prior information from their nature, so to speak. But that's really false. And if you compare different species, you see that it's false. If you compare a fly, a chicken, a wolf, a chimpanzee, you have species where, going from left to right, you have organisms that acquire very little information from their environment, to organisms like chickens or wolves that acquire more information from their environments, to chimps that acquire a lot of information from their environments. And you can see that if you go from the ones that acquire less to the ones that acquire more, you have also the ones that are born with a less complex brain and a smaller brain with less complex organization, and you go to more and more complex organization. So the more information you acquire from your environment, the more you need to start with. So what we think about when we think about cognitive systems is that these are learning systems. So that's an obvious point that we can make about language. You know, we have this system that acquires language, but of course it acquires lots of different languages, but only those languages that fit certain expectations. And that is true of other mental systems. Attractiveness, for example, for people is a system. We have local cues, you know, we have local cultural values, but those are within the parameters of this system that comes from human evolution. So the question, when you have something in the minds of people or a cultural practice, is not, is it innate or learned, because that doesn't really mean anything. The question is, what evolved systems in the human minds, because of our genetic evolution, allowed us to learn it? And that's the question with which I will end this presentation, reminding you that this is the way in this book I try to address all these different questions about societies. Thank you.
Thank you, Pascal. It was really an inspiring lecture. And I guess there might be questions or comments from the audience. There are some. You can do it in English.
Я хотел спросить, вы говорили, что люди формируют там свое мнение по тому или иному вопросу, основываясь на багаже своих знаний, то есть на каком-то личном опыте, пережитом ранее. При этом мне интересно, в какой момент у людей формируется полностью там, какое-то их мировоззрение, потому что очень часто слышу, что там, его уже не изменить. Вот. То есть в какой-то момент есть какая-то переломная точка, после чего люди перестают, скажем так, воспринимать новый опыт и постоянно акцентируют внимание на том, что они уже знают.
Pascal, did you have an English translation of that, or shall I translate it?
I didn't have the translation from Sasha.
Okay, so the question was, in the development of the individual human mind, there is a point when human beliefs are completely formed, and it can be said about such a person that his mind cannot be changed anymore. How does this point emerge, how do you think, and why does it emerge?
Well, yes, I would like to think that this point does not emerge because given my age, if it emerges at all, I must be beyond it. And I would like to think that I can still change my mind. But I think that is a question that very much depends on the kinds of beliefs and mental systems we're talking about. So, for example, in terms of very basic capacities like acquiring language, we know that acquiring our natural language, our first language, is very easy from the age of 0 till 7 or 8. It becomes a bit difficult afterwards, and it becomes very difficult afterwards. But also we know that once you have integrated this first language, it is there forever and will influence the way you acquire different languages. So for that, we know we have a period of specific learning that is closed at some point and results in fixed beliefs. Now, when it isn't for things like religious beliefs, for example, I would say it's almost the opposite, in the sense that it's quite clear that we have early acquisition of some beliefs, but it's also clear that those beliefs change throughout the lifetime, and that there's much more plasticity. The reason why they seem to be very fixed is that very often they are associated, I'm talking about religious beliefs here, they are associated with group identity, with moral values, and other important aspects of our minds, such that we think we cannot change, for example, these religious beliefs without losing other aspects of our mental life. So, for example, lots of people who are becoming skeptical of their religious beliefs still want to keep them there because they think that, for example, if their religious beliefs are gone, their morality will be gone. That's not entirely true, but that may be true. Let me take a third example, political beliefs. So we know that they are both stable in some ways and occasionally change. So, for example, you'll find that many young people are more for redistribution of wealth, and many older people are less for redistribution of wealth. And the main reason for that is quite simply that the older people have accumulated some wealth. So the more you have, the less you want to share, obviously. But also, this is something also where I think it's not just that you have the belief, but you have the belief and associations with, for example, what group you are in. You know, if you believe in this kind of politics, then you are a member of certain movements, you are against other movements, and so on and so forth. And these things are, it's not so much that the belief itself is fixed, but it's that it would be costly for us to change the belief. But it does happen, but it's at a cost, yes. And that's why there is that fixedness, I think.
Thank you. More questions?
Pascal, I'm online, ready to translate for you.
Okay,
Can you hear
thank
me?
you. Yes, I'm good.
Скажите, пожалуйста, вот вы сказали, что люди стремятся к справедливости и к тому, чтобы наказывать этих жуликов, которые хотят ничего не делать и при этом что-то получать. Но при этом люди сами довольно часто стремятся ничего не делать и что-то получать. Вот как это соотносится? Что они не хотят, чтобы кто-то другой жульничал, но при этом сами часто стремятся жульничать. Вот.
Okay. Well, of course, when I said that people have a preference for fairness, I didn't want you to think that they always behave in a way that's fair. But what I want to emphasize is that to the extent that we have this this preference for fair exchange, that is what constrains others to behave in a fair way. In the sense that, for example, the way you can get, and this is something we see in modern forms of business. You know, suppose you. If you're a contractor, for example, you want to get lots of people to give you money to paint their houses and do things like that. Now, what do? Of course, you'd like to take their money and not do the work, and that's what you really very much like to do. But what you know is that that's not really going to happen. So what you have to do, for example, is have a good reputation. Show them that there are previous customers, who can tell you that they behaved in a nice way and they did the work. In modern commerce, we use websites for that. You want to go to a restaurant and you look at the website for the restaurant, and there are websites, for example, that tell you that some people went there and they were and that was terrible, and the food was not great and the price was too high. Now, that is the way our preference, individual preference for fairness in others, constrains us to be mostly fair in what we do. Now, obviously, you could say, well, hang on, there is still exploitation that happens. And precisely the point is that exploitation happens when people are coerced, are forced into a transaction that they would refuse if they had all the information or if they had enough power. In other words, this kind of fairness intuition can only work and can only make people fair when they are equal power partners. To the extent that you have inequality of power, then you get pure exploitation. But that's not against the idea that we have this fairness system. We have this fairness system, and sometimes other people have the power to violate this system. So once again, I mean, it's the I think the reason why let me get back to your original question. We all want, or we'd like to do nothing and receive lots of payment. However, we will never receive anything that way, and we have the intuition that that's the way it works. So because of that, we are forced to do a bit to get something. When we do a bit that is not enough, others are there to tell us, no, you're exploiting me, you have to do more. And there is a certain equilibrium in that kind of exchange if we are equal partners.
Спасибо.
There are also a couple of questions from Perm, where there was the translation of your lecture, and I think I'll take just two of them. The first one is, how do you think is the overconsumption of information due to new digital technologies somehow change our evolutionary systems, our evolutionary models, or do they work still the same?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so it's true that the modern environment with internet communication in particular is really interesting because in many aspects it reveals our human nature even better than before. And for example, we've built systems that can give you enormous amounts of information about lots of stuff. And what we see is, so for example, you would say, well, what do you predict, knowing human nature? What do you predict that they will use that for? Well, for example, as I said, you see the emergence of websites that give you information about all sorts of companies and businesses, and it tells you whether they were fair or unfair or good or bad in the eyes of the public. So, and that's exactly what you would predict from the way we interact in a small-scale tribal society. We want to know whether the people we interact with have been fair or unfair to other people. But also, think of gossip. We know that there's a lot of gossip in all human societies, and in all human societies, people say that gossip is very bad, and at the same time, they exchange gossip all the time. And gossip is mostly information about other people's in terms of other people's activities in terms of sex, power, and wealth, or or exchange. So that's what gossip is about. And you would think, well, if that's part of human nature, when we give people information to talk about these things, they will talk about that, and mostly about that. And then you realize that you have the development of sites like social media sites like Facebook or Snapchat or Instagram, and you see that 90% of the content is that kind of stuff. So in that sense, we seem to be in the same sort of human nature. People used to say, to sit down around a fire in a tribal society and say, did you know who slept with whom and when? And I'm going to tell you because I know, and that's really exciting to know about that. And what you do the same more or less on Instagram or Snapchat, and that's what you exchange information about. So in that sense, yes, it's the same human nature. But the fact that there's enormous access to lots of resources can have effects that are very new, that are things that we've never seen. And that's true for, so for example, for the use of social media. It's true in politics. In the United States, for example, Twitter has become extremely important in politics in the sense that if you say something that is seen to be offensive by some people, you immediately have thousands of people sending Twitter messages to say that this is terrible. And then because there are thousands repeating those messages, and very quickly you have millions of people doing this. This is the kind of phenomenon that would not happen in another kind of society, because after a while, you've gone around all the people who could share that information, and that's it. They all have it. So in this sense, you can create new phenomena. There are people who say that controlling, having some influence on those social media sites is going to be more important for politics than anything else. So basically, for modern politicians, what they do when they're in power or in opposition does not really matter as much as how the crowds react to what they do on Twitter or Facebook. And that can change these things. It's not so much the, and also, finally, there's one aspect, which is that in societies where we evolved, and in many societies until very recently, you could not say bad things about people without potentially paying a cost. You can't go around saying that so-and-so is a murderer or so-and-so is a thief, because that person may hear about that, and that person's friends may hear about that, and you may be in trouble if it's not true. So you have a cost for information that you spread. The modern social media world makes it very different. There is no cost at all. So that means that you're likely to have lots of what are called witch hunts, that is, hunting witches, like people used to do in medieval societies. That is going to happen because in medieval societies, you had to be careful because before you accuse someone of being a witch, because you might be in serious trouble. But in modern society, you can do it for free. I mean, there's no cost, and no one would even know who did it because most of these things are anonymous. So there are lots of phenomena that may appear, and we may yet have to see some of the new ones that will appear, that will make society very different in that way. Yeah.
But basically, it's the same problem of scaling, right?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. One more question, which I guess I know the answer. I mean, the question from Perm. They ask, what's the role of genetic factors or genes in economic or religious beliefs?
Well, some people have done lots of research about that, and I must say that on the one hand, the role of genes in the sense of the genes we all human beings have in common is extremely important, because we have intuitions about how to be fair, how to be unfair, what to resist, what to accept, and so on and so forth. That part of our common genome is very important. So then people have tried to do something else, which is to say, well, but humans are genetically different. And does this have an effect on their economic or political ideas? To some degree it does, in the sense that it's true that, for example, you find that a certain more conservative orientation or more sort of progressive liberal orientation are things that tend to go in families and also tend to be inherited even when you don't have input from the family. However, the problem is that it's that we don't know why, and we don't know how that works for a very good reason, which is that we never evolved to be conservatives or progressives or any of these things. We probably evolved to have different personalities, ways to react to events, which in the context of a modern society make you more conservative or less conservative. But what are those ways of being, those personality differences? We just don't know. And so, yes, it's possible to say, well, to a certain degree of approximation, you will predict someone's politics from their inheritance, their biological inheritance. But I think that's still something that is very new, and that is, unfortunately, that kind of research is done mostly by American political scientists who think that the kind of politics one has in the United States is the only kind of politics there is. And because of that, for example, they'll think that the big thing is whether you're conservative or liberal. But think of another country. Go to Turkey, for example, and that's not the problem. The problem is whether you're more religious or more secular and nationalistic. Go to China, the question is whether you're more nationalistic or more free trade and globalist. So I think those studies are very disappointing because of that exclusive focus on one country in the world, and also because we don't really know what the variables are.
Okay, thanks. One more question from our Moscow audience.
Во-первых, вы почти ответили на мой вопрос. Я хотела спросить, как вы относитесь к такой категории, как совесть. Вы уже об этом поговорили. И дальше был вопрос, является ли это человеческая характеристика врожденной и наследственной. Ну, только что на этот вопрос почти ответили, и это очень интересное мнение, потому что под большой вопрос ставится вопрос воспитания. Когда мы ругаем ребенка за то, что он бессовестный, теперь, оказывается, мы должны посмотреть на себя, если это качество наследуемое. Спасибо за интересный разговор и за интересные ответы.
You have almost answered the question here, in fact. So the question is about the category of conscience. And the question is whether it's inherited or not. And if it is, why do we blame our kids that they are not conscientious enough? And shouldn't we rather look at our own nature and its evolution?
I think, yes, that's very much the case. It's interesting that moral intuitions and moral feelings are another one of those specialized systems that I was describing. And it's certainly the case that they are a special system because there is one kind of pathology where most of your mind works okay, but you don't have that system. That's what happens when the individuals that we call psychopath or psychopathy, those people who are exploitative, cynical, and sometimes very successful because they manage to fool lots of people and exploit them. Now, those people have a normal human mind, except they don't have this little bit of software that makes you react to, for example, injustice or harming other people with a negative feeling. And because they don't have that, they just see the benefits of those actions. So I think in terms of blaming our children, the thing is that I think unless you're unfortunate, and have a psychopathic child, your child will develop their consciousness, their moral conscience, no matter what you tell them. The thing is that, of course, the reason why these interactions are difficult with children is that children know very well that they can exploit you and they will not have many consequences. But they also know that they can't exploit other people very easily. So really, we shouldn't worry too much about that. And we should trust that their mental systems will develop the right way.
Okay, and one more question from the Moscow audience. Yeah, here. In just a minute, we're passing the mic.
Здравствуйте. Если не брать образованность человека в определенной сфере, то на бытовом уровне происходит ли у человечества развитие фильтрации информации, которую мы получаем?
If we consider the development through the prism of education, does filtering of information develop through evolution and through the life course? How do you think?
I think because of I think it's possible to have an effect, of course, on our mental systems, and that's why we have education. Even in primitive societies, education that goes way beyond what we would naturally expect from the environment in order to give you better information. There's even evidence that even very young infants are sensitive to the difference between two situations. One situation is when people are just talking to them, and the other situation when people are talking to them in order to tell them some important information about the world. There are lots of experiments that show that infants are sensitive to that difference, and that adults, without realizing, talk in a different way, point to things in a different way, and so on and so forth. So what we do constantly is accumulate lots of information. Some of it goes against our intuitive systems that I described here, and they require lots of effort. Some of them require very little effort. So to give you a comparison, it's quite clear that in order to understand trigonometry or things like that, you have to go way beyond what your natural expectations about the world give you. And that's why it takes a lot of effort, and it takes, being in a special room with a special person for hours every week for years before you get to that level. On the other hand, understanding your religious concepts, not so much. You can just go and join the communal celebrations and you understand more or less all there is to understand about that system. So it depends completely on the system. There are bits of our knowledge where education is incredibly important and required, and nothing could be acquired without it. And there are domains where it's not even really necessary.
Thank you. And may I ask a more methodological question? I hope the audience is not yet exhausted. As I understand, you follow the task-instrument metaphor common for the modular approach towards cognitive evolution, which means that we develop cognitive instruments or mental instruments for different tasks of adaptation, like motion detectors or visual statistic detectors. And the same happens with, say, fairness or cheater detection, because they just meet the task of adaptation. And then when we try to scale them to the modern community, we get various fallacies and cognitive biases and whatever. And What do you think? What's your opinion about the dual inheritance theories of cognitive evolution? The theories which propose that culture evolves the same way as our biological nature, cultural practices are being selected or lost, and humans with certain genes create cultural practices, which means a culture, and the culture prioritizes the certain genes, and therefore they begin intertwining through the course of evolution. So what do you think of that?
Yes. Thank you for it. It's a complicated question, but I think the main answer is that, of course, I agree with this sort of notion of dual inheritance, in the sense that by creating societies, we create environments that are the environment of evolution for the next generation, and that's something that is, I think, not just recognized by dual inheritance theories, but has been true of most people who work on the connections between human evolution and cultural constructions. So, for example, by having societies that had more and more people around, we've made it possible, we've created environments in which being able to interact with lots of people and maintain interaction with lots of new people all the time is something that is selected for. That is, I wouldn't want you to think that just because I talked about evolutionary problems and evolutionary solutions by mental systems, I did not want to also recognize that this creates feedback in the sense that humans create environmental conditions that have an impact on genetic evolution. It's been true for lots of things. There are spectacular examples of that, like, for example, the northern European populations can digest milk very well, and that's mostly because they depended on milk for many thousands of years in such a way that created a context in which having genes that favor lactose absorption, digestion, were favored, and all the other people who did not have that good a tolerance for lactose were just eliminated. They didn't have any offspring. So that is the kind of condition in which you have a cultural practice that is using milk from big mammals as a source of nutrition, has had a huge genetic impact. And it has had that impact on other populations in the world. In the same way, Eurasian populations from Europe and Asia domesticated lots of animals, and that changed our immune system in such a way that we are, in terms of immune system, really different from people who are whose ancestors, direct ancestors, are from Africa or from native populations in the Americas. So yes, that kind of feedback effect is, of course, required to have a complete view of how evolution and culture interact.
Well, thanks. And one more related question. In the last part of your talk, you emphasized the paradox about the more information or the system uses, the less prior information is needed, which is definitely false. But for me, actually, the more information we use, the longer childhood we need to form the whole system, to develop the whole system.
Yes.
But if we have evolutionary solutions for most of the situations, why this longer childhood?
Yes,
it's
because those systems, and that's true of those different species, that the more they acquire, the more they have in a longer infancy and juvenile stages. And the reason for that is that those systems are not systems that give you the solutions, the behaviors. Those systems are systems that tell you where to learn and what to pay attention to in order to learn. They're learning systems. They're not systems that give you a fixed solution. So, for example, the learning system for attractiveness will tell you that you have to attend to cues of health and youth and fertility in other people. Well, those can be very different in different ecologies. So you have to pay attention to that. And in other words, the evolution does not give you the solution. It gives you the means to get to the solution that would be appropriate in your environment. So a simple example of that is acquiring language. Of course, we could have a language system in which all the words are genetically specified. And then we would have a vocabulary, and that would be the one we have because our genes give it to us. So what evolution gave us is something completely much more economical, which is that we don't have the 50,000 words of our vocabulary. We trust that they're stored in other people's speech. And what we have is only the capacity to attend to them and acquire them as they are found in that speech, and that's it. So that's why I think the more systems you have, the more time you have for you to learn.
Thank you. Well, we're here for almost 2 hours, and now I've got a question to you as a specialist in memory limitations. We have to choose the 3 best questions, both from our Moscow audience and from our Perm audience. The questions I read from the laptop, and we do not take into account my questions. So which of the questions from today do you consider the most interesting ones?
Well, I think that all of them were pretty interesting, but I am especially interested in 2 things. One is that in what way do we handle information better or in a different way now that we have much more information and much easier access to information? I think that is a very, very important question, because that is one way in which our world has changed in the last 20 years, more than it had changed for hundreds of years or thousands of years. And another question is that I thought was pretty important was, well, if we have preferences for certain kinds of behavior, like fairness, and we have a strong motivation not to engage in those behaviors, how do the 2 get together? And I think the fact, and it's a good question because it shows one thing that's crucially important about human beings, which is that we depend on others so much that the preferences of others are the crucial environment for our own behavior. So these are the main ones that I remember as being pretty interesting. I must say that I'm officially a professor of memory, but I do not have good memory, so do not try to.
Okay, well, we have 3 of your religion books, but we've got 2 best questions. So one of the book will go back to the publisher, or will the publisher choose the 3rd best question? Or the organizer, or whatever? No? Okay. Let the organizer of this event choose the 3rd best question. So it will be your job. And Pascal, may I ask you for the concluding comment for our audience?
Well, I didn't know I would have to provide concrete comments, but I have one comment, which is that all these questions were really fascinating, and that's why I have difficulty choosing. And they show, I think, that it's possible to have a conversation about these very important sort of scientific issues, where we do not need jargon. We don't need to, but we can exchange fascinating facts about humans and how they evolve. And that's the main and very optimistic conclusion that I would have.
Okay, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing your insights. And we're looking forward to the publication of your second book in Russian.
Okay,
It's really nice having you here.
Maria.
Thank you.
And thanks to the organizer and the audience. Thank you. It's late over there, but you people are privileged because now you can go and have a beer. I have to go and teach a course in 20 minutes. So have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.